Give it another minute or two. I'll go ahead and start. So welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Linda and I'm a health educator for Community Health at Atlantic Health Systems. Today's webinar, Dispelling and Navigating Myths About Grief, is presented by Marian Teehan. Marian Teehan is a licensed clinical social worker with over 35 years experience in hospital social work, administration, and consulting. Managing the Thomas Glossier Caregivers Center at Overlook Medical Center since its founding 10 years ago, fulfilled a long-held dream of providing support to family caregivers. Marian's passion and concern for family caregivers grew out of her early life experience of losing a parent at a young age, when support services and understanding about grief were not as well developed. She has continued to learn by obtaining advanced degrees in death and grief studies from the Center for Loss and has a postgraduate certificate in end-of-life care from Smith School of Social Work. Recently, Marian became board certified in advanced palliative and hospice social work, and Marian practices self-care incorporating her mindfulness and Tai Chi training. Before we begin, I have a few announcements. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared in its entirety on our website. All participants are muted. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button, and for comments, please use the chat. We'll try to get through all questions at the end of the presentation. Our Healthy Aging program at Atlantic Health Systems is a great resource to assist you or a loved one with obtaining many helpful services and information on topics of interest. For a comprehensive list of services, you can visit atlantichealth.org/senior services. I'm now going to turn it over to Marian.
Share my screen.
Yes, share screen.
All right, perfect. Everyone, they can see the screen and we're good?
Yes, you just have to go ahead and select the slideshow.
1 second here. Thank you.
No worries.
Perfect. Okay.
Not yet. Didn't change on my end.
Sorry.
That's okay.
There
we go. Now we should be good.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda.
Of course.
Thank you all for coming. I wish I could see you. But it's a real honor to be able to come here today to talk about grief and loss, because it's really one of our most common human experiences, yet we don't talk about it, right? It's still very taboo. So this afternoon, to be able to share this with you, really about the myths about grief, and how really just understanding them and realizing that they're out there can really help you grieve and mourn well. And that means to go on to live well and love well. So I'm really glad you're here today. So we'll get started with this first myth, misconception, right? So a misconception or a myth is a mistaken notion, but it's something that we believe, but maybe it is not true. And most times it's not true. And I think what it can do is it can really cause unrealistic expectations in our grief. Right? When we lose someone we love, when someone we love dies, there's so many different losses, but they make us feel and judge ourselves, right? and cause those unrealistic expectations. So you may find today that you know some of these, or they might be new, or you may have others. There are so many that are out there. So I'm just, so we're simply looking at it today from a way of like getting some new insights to either help yourself if you're currently grieving, or to help friends and family, right? Because we all experience loss. So the first myth is really about grief and mourning. And it seems like, why would we need to make this distinction? It's very subtle. So everyone grieves, but not everyone mourns, because they're not the same thing. And as you can see, it talks about grief being all those feelings and emotions, the anger, the sadness, the physical part, all those things. It's like the container for all that we're feeling. Okay, so everyone grieves, but not everyone mourns, because when we're mourning, we're taking all what's inside us and bringing it out. Okay, opening up that container, opening up ourselves up. We really start, right, the mourning process when we have a funeral, a wake, sitting Shiva. So that really takes our grief inside, going public. And so why is that so important, that distinction? Because grief is kind of passive. Like, you're having those feelings, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing anything, right? You're not sharing them or talking about them. But mourning is like really going and talking about that person, that loss. You know, when we think about the funeral, that's where we, or whatever's in your culture, whatever you might have when someone dies, it's really where we gather up our support system and it becomes real, the death. Now, during COVID, many of us, I don't know if any of you on the call would have had this, but we were really robbed of that ability to have that public display of our grief, right? Funerals weren't held, or if they did, they were smaller. We had things on Zoom. But one thing I want to say is it's never too late to do rituals, and rituals are very healing. Okay. So that's the grief and mourning. So think about mourning as being very active. So grief needs motion. Our emotions need motion. So that mourning, you know, in the old days, right, when someone died, there were customs. You wore black. There were bands that people wore. So when people looked at you, they knew you were bereaved, right? And to be bereaved is really to be broken, right? Your heart is broken. So you need special care. And now a lot of those customs, right, are not in place any longer. So sometimes we have to make sure we ask and get that help, right? So the second one I really wanted to talk about today is the myth number 2. Grief and mourning progress in predictable and early, orderly stages. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a groundbreaking book on death and dying in 1969. And it was really powerful because for the first time, you had this physician who had interviewed all these dying people, and she was on all the talk shows, and she brought out death into the public, right? So we could talk about it. So people latched onto it because here there was a scientific, right, research that said, okay, first you're denial and then you're angry and bargaining. She never meant it to become so rigid. And in our society, in our culture now, we have really internalized this. What happens is then we start to judge ourselves. Oh, I should be here. Wait, I'm not in this stage. And we don't even realize we're doing it. But that's not what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wanted. She really interviewed, they were dying patients. And yes, many people go through this, but you can go back and forth. And many of these feelings that we have, we would have them, you know, during grief and our mourning. As a young girl, Linda mentioned, I mean, why I'm in this field is because when I was a young girl, my mother died. And that was the only book I could find in my school library. I was 13. And I read that on death and dying, and it helped me. So I know how powerful this is, but also as the years have gone on, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross went on to write, and please, she said, don't do that to yourselves, right? Because grief and mourning, it's a journey, right? So you feel one day this way, and then people will even say, well, are you over it yet? Well, she should be over it. And there is no timeline in grief, right? There is no timeline. Everyone's grief and mourning are so unique to that person. It's like your thumbprint. And I think when we start to compare, we can cause harm to ourselves and others. We could say, oh, I should be here. Why am I still crying like this? No, it's okay. It's all right. And she did a lot of research and went on to write more books. But this myth is really in our culture very much accepted. So myth number 3, it is best to move away from grief and mourning instead of towards it. And again, many well-meaning friends and families members, they don't want to see you sad, and you don't want to see them sad if you're here thinking, how to help others. But you really almost have to make grief your friend. I mean, I run support groups, and yesterday, actually, a gentleman said, I hate grief. I hate it. You know what? Yeah, because those messy, messy feelings and loneliness. But if we don't share it, talk about it, move those feelings, they just stay in and they can just get pushed down. And what happens then when we don't deal with our losses? We can get physically ill. We can get very depressed. Addictions. So there's all different things that can happen from this carried grief, right? But grief is normal. It's a normal response to losing someone or something we love. So it's not pathological at all. But we do have to kind of make friends with it and sit with it. And I'm not saying that every day you need to sit there and dwell on it. No, we talk a lot in our groups about dosing, about taking time each day and just being mindful and sitting and maybe looking at pictures if that's comfortable. So there's all different ways to work on this grief. But we do kind of have to make friends with it and to go towards it, to go kind of through the pain so we can come out on the other end, because it is a journey. But you don't need to do that journey alone. There is help, and you can help friends and be very supportive of each other. And I think just learning about these myths can be very helpful. So I'm glad you're here. So myth number 4, tears of grief are only a sign of weakness. So I think people get really uncomfortable when someone cries. I work here in the Caregivers Center, and families are going through probably the worst days of their lives. And, we want to make people feel better, but, tears are a beautiful expression. It's our body's way of releasing, right, that emotion. And sometimes we're so quick to hand that tissue because we don't want people crying all over, but we don't want to give that message either that it's a sign of weakness, because it's not. Tears of grief really can help foster that genuine healing, right? I think sometimes people feel, and they've said it in my groups, I'm in ShopRite and then I see a box of Cheerios and that's what I would buy, right? And this overwhelming sense of tears. So yes, eventually we want to be able to control maybe when we cry, but that's not possible, especially early on in grief. And maybe 2 years out, you'll still cry a little, and that's okay. And I think that's the message. That you're not being selfish. Sometimes people feel like, oh my God, tell her, really stop now, right? They may say that, or come on, stop crying, get over it, put your chin up. And I'm here to tell you, yeah, those tears of grief are very powerful. And not everyone cries, and that's okay too, right? So sometimes, you could not cry and say, what's wrong with me? But like I said, everyone really grieves differently. We need to know that and give ourselves permission. So the goal is to get over your grief. And I've kind of mentioned that a little, that's a message that we hear. Are you over it yet? And are you feeling better? And I don't think anyone means this, in a negative way. But in our culture, that's kind of what we've been taught now. Get over it, buck up, put your brave face on. Have you ever asked someone, how you doing today? And then maybe they'll bust out crying, right? But sometimes just saying to some, how you doing today? Like, what's going on today? Because that's a big question. How are you? Oh, and do you really want to hear it? And that's why finding someone, a friend, a spiritual person, anyone that you can share. You just need, almost like they call it a grief buddy, but it's just someone who you can trust. It could be a journal, right? Yeah. It could be just going to yoga. It could be sitting out in nature. But the grieving process, this journey I talk about, it's not something we get over. It's really never done. But there's hope. Look how many people have gone through horrendous things. So look at people in your life and around you who are strong and resilient. Humankind, we're really strong and resilient people, but we do need to work on it and not push all those feelings down. But there's so much hope. There's hope to love again, to live again, and to feel joy again. Because when you're in the midst of acute grief early on, you don't see hope. You can't see through that tunnel. But I am here to tell you that working and doing the work of mourning, taking that grief public, no, you never get over it, but you grow around it, right? The grief gets smaller, maybe, and you grow and get stronger around it. Yeah. So this myth, number 6, this misconception. Yeah. So at the funeral, or as soon as possible, you have to say goodbye. And when we think about the purpose of a funeral, and it could be a funeral, whatever in your, whatever you would do, it's not really to say goodbye. It's actually to say hello, because the relationship has now changed with your person. They died, they're physically not here, but that connection can never, ever be taken away. The memories, good, bad, right? That the attachment. And we talk a lot in our groups, and we really believe in this, about supporting that connection, keeping the memory alive. And then again, that's something maybe other people you'll get a message, you shouldn't be doing that. But if you're working on your grief, yeah, that time is really to say hello to the person who died. We've gotten so away from the whole idea of funerals and wakes, and maybe having celebration of life, which is a beautiful thing, but sometimes the person is not even there, right? And that's who it's about, even. So the funeral serves a purpose. And again, during COVID, I worked here in the hospital and talked to many, many families, and we supported them, but they weren't even allowed to have a funeral. So, or gather, right? Just remember gathering, like when someone dies, you all get together, people bring casseroles, like all that was taken away. And I feel like maybe we've seen the importance of those rituals. But again, never too late to have a ritual. I'm a firm believer. And you can have personal rituals, public rituals. And that's a whole nother talk, but it's never too late. Yeah. And funerals and memorial services can be very meaningful, but we do have to make them meaningful, right? But the whole point is really to start accepting kind of that reality that our person is gone. So myth Number 7, when someone you love dies, you only grieve and mourn for the physical loss of the person. There's so many ripple losses, ripple effects, right? When someone, your person dies, the loss of self, right? Who am I? You know, if it was your child, am I still a mother? Yes, right? If you're a husband, a wife. So you struggle with that loss of your identity, security. Maybe for the first time you're living alone. You don't feel so safe. Right? Loss of meaning, like, and that self-identity again, but who am I? Right? Who am I? What's my life now? And it all depends too on the relationship you had with that person. And but these are areas that I think we need to acknowledge and just be aware of, that yes, the physical person, you miss them, but it really impacts your whole life. And I run a lot of groups for spouses and partners, and they've been married 50 years, right? And now all of a sudden your whole identity, and also the loss of the future. Okay, you had plans. If it was a young child, if it was a spouse, a partner, right? So all those are shattered. So there's a lot of different levels and layers, and it's just really important to just to be aware. So if you have a friend, you know, who's grieving, and you think, wow, like in all the areas of their life that it can be impacted, and for yourself. So myth number 8, when grief and mourning are finally reconciled, they may never come up again. So we do talk a lot about grief being reconciled, so not getting over it. And so what does that mean, reconciled? So it's really coming to terms with it, understanding it, starting to feel that joy and hope again, coming out of that fog. So it's like a resolution, but again, it's not like a one and done. It's not like there's a line in the sand and then you're over it and you never go back, right? But the feelings get softer. You start to experience joy again, right? You develop some meaning, your new identity. So they do come up again. And I just wrote down here these grief bursts. So many times very early in grief, you're going to have those. And we kind of talk about in our groups really about those grief bursts just coming on unexpected. You're in the car driving, you turn on the radio, and bam, like the tears are just coming. And sometimes maybe you'd be at work and that might happen. And that's hard, right? Because it feels a little out of control. So the grief burst may continue, but they'll be less frequent. I had one woman in my group years ago who called it a tsunami, and it always stuck with me, like the ocean, right? Boom. And it was just so out of control. And that's scary. So we want to be able to kind of control it, but also then let it come. And don't be ashamed if you're crying, right? Because it's normal. And I think that's what's so important, that people try to almost like grief. If you are grieving and showing your emotions, there's something wrong with you. You're weak. And I'm here to tell you, no, that's how we get through this and come and find joy again. On the opposite of a grief burst, we could say a love burst. You know, so last week in my group, someone really spoke openly how, like, looking at the pictures, all of a sudden it's bringing her so much joy. So that's like a love burst. Where someone else looking at pictures is still hard 2 years later, right? So we can't compare our grief. We can't judge our grief because it's your grief, right? You're the expert. I'm not the expert as a social worker of your grief, right? I may have trained, I may have learned things, I experienced loss, it shaped who I am. But you're really the expert in what you need. So myth number 8, nobody can help you with your grief, right? So there is help, and there's lots of help. And this quote I liked: there is no path so dark, nor road so steep, nor hill so slippery that other people have not been there before me and survived. May the dark times teach me to help the people that I love on similar journeys. So if you think of my story and how as a young 13-year-old, I read that on Death and Dying, and then went to college and studied social work, and later on, have always trained now really to help others. So that's like probably my finding meaning in that tragic loss. And it doesn't mean that everyone's going to do that, right? But there is help, and it can be a support group. It can just be a good friend who's a good listener. And I think what's important is sometimes we feel when we lose someone, you'll be surprised, and I hear it all the time. I really thought she would be more helpful, and shocked because somebody, a neighbor down the street, is the one who's really your support. Right? And we often talk about the rule of thirds. So like a third of the people will be very helpful, a third will not be helpful at all, and a third will be just neutral. So we really want to surround ourselves, even as just that one person. So there's support groups, there's individual, and there's just really attending something like today and other workshops and reading. So a lot of today's presentation, I've studied a lot with Dr. Alan Wolfelt in Colorado, and his whole model of grief and bereavement is about companioning, right? Not fixing, because there's nothing to be fixed. This grief is really this normal reaction to a loss. There's wonderful websites. So there are ways, if you're struggling, there is help out there. And I think Atlantic Health, is wonderful to be offering this program and others that I see that are coming up. I run support groups here at Overlook Medical Center on Zoom. And I know Atlantic Health has a weekly grief group as well, and many groups in the community. So I will be providing my information and contact information, because I feel bad I can't see you who's attending, and hopefully in the questions we can answer any questions. But just know that there is help, and that you can call and I can direct you, because there's all different types of groups. And I love this quote by Helen Keller. What we once enjoyed and deeply loved, we can never lose, for all that we love deeply becomes part of us. Talking again about that continuing bond, which may be a message that people are, you're not getting, and they're subtle. Oh, she still has all those pictures up, right? And then you judge yourself. So I hope today's, presentation just trying to show you, and again, these misconceptions are just kind of rooted in our culture, and we aren't aware of them. And there's so many more. And so if you have any, please, put them in the chat, and we can talk about them. And I hope you have some questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll stop sharing.
Sure, you can stop
sharing. There we go.
And then, as she just said, if anyone has any questions or comments, please, we're here. We'd be happy to answer. You can use the Q&A for questions, the chat for any comments. Go ahead and give everyone a moment to see.
Yeah, I know it's hard when you can't, just unmute and talk, but just take your time. And if you have any thoughts, yeah. And again, Linda will be sending out that information with my contact information. Yeah. And And some articles that you might find helpful that are written by Dr. Wolfelt. Yeah.
Of course.
So I'll forward that to you. No questions.
We do. Oh, we have a comment. We thank you for this presentation. It truly helps to hear these tips to relieve grief. Another person said, great presentation. Thank you so much for that feedback. We always love to hear.
Yeah. I think by learning, it's empowering, right? So, because the messages we can get is like there's something wrong with us if we're still crying, and it's okay. Right?
Yes. Another person, the chat wasn't working for them, but they wanted to say thank you and that this person didn't know there was a difference between grief and mourning and that it makes sense.
Yeah. And some of these, you don't think about them. But it's a little subtle thing, but it does make a difference. Yeah. And there's so many more. Yeah. Like some of them are if you're crying or, then you don't have faith, right? That your faith isn't there because you're so sad and you shouldn't be. So that can really cause a lot of guilt. So there's a lot of different ones. Yeah.
We have another comment. This person thanked you for the presentation, and they shared that they are an end-of-life doula who during the pandemic made a transition into the recovery community, and that they now incorporate a lot of grief support in their Zoom groups, and even allowed this person to share their journey when their mother passed away in 2021, and that it was very healing for everyone to witness and unfold. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. And the life doula is really such a beautiful, beautiful role they can play. And what a difference for a family and for the person, and especially in the family's bereavement later on in their mourning. Such important work. So thank you.
Yeah. And then someone else shared that they have experienced grief bursts and that it is now good to know that this is normal and that they are looking forward to love bursts.
Yes. Yeah. And it does take time. Time alone, though. So that's another one, right? So time alone, when I talked about that, kind of pushing down the feelings. So, just time alone won't make the feelings get softer. There is some work involved, right? And the work can come in all different forms. Reading, writing, talking, being out in nature, just going out to breakfast with a good friend. But I think what's really important is keeping the memory alive, right? And you set the tone if it was your really close person for outsiders. So if you'll bring up their name and speak their name, that will help the other people because maybe they don't want to upset you, right? So bringing them up, and that's really keeping that bond, right? And I have to tell you, my father-in-law, I never met him. I mean, he died when my husband was 17. My mother-in-law kept his memory. I knew his favorite food. I never met the man. But in my family, they struggled and my father had a hard time. So, as I got older, I had to reach out and kind of ask very pointed questions because it was too painful for him at the time to talk about her. Right? So also how we dealt with grief and losses early on in our life impact later ones. Right? They can compound, right? And as we age, we lose more and more people. So, but there's always hope. And that's really my biggest message is that there's always hope and help out there if you need it.
I don't want to rush anyone. So
No, I know it
here
takes
for
a while to do that. Yeah.
give it another minute or two if anyone else has anything else to share or another question.
The feeling of being cheated of time. Yes. Yeah. Not fair. Yeah. And then how do you work through that? And you said you might try journaling. Yeah. There's also a wonderful, and I'm starting to do this, is some grief yoga. So there's all and regular yoga as well, and I do Tai Chi, and we offer it here. But I think emotions need some motion, and one is journaling, yeah, and yoga, things like that. What are good words to comfort another when you really don't know what to say? That's a great question. So sometimes there is nothing to say but to listen. And I think as a social worker, sometimes, I train social workers here and they want to jump in and fix. And we can't. And as a friend, and sometimes being a listener, an active listener, and we may think we're good at it. So your presence, they'll always remember your presence. People, of course, I'm sorry for your loss. It just comes out, right? But then just taking the time and sitting, and instead of saying, what can I do for you? Just think of something and do it, right? That's how we can really help. Yeah. Like, give me something specific. But I think the biggest thing is that being present and not trying to fix them and let them share. Yeah. Sometimes there are no words. So when there are no words, rituals are really good, right? Yeah. I do talk about my mom. Yeah, so they don't forget her. That's beautiful. So important. And I show, a very personal example, but, my father struggled, and later on he was able to, but still not so well. But yet my mother-in-law is so different that I knew everything. So memories and pictures are so important, because even though those grandchildren may not have ever met them, that's a legacy. That's a connection. Yeah, beautiful. And I think, at the holidays as they approach can be a really hard time. And I think we're having some programs about holidays and grief. It can really bring up a lot. But I encourage families to talk openly, maybe, have a toast or eat their favorite meal, or, right? So keeping those memories. I'm just sliding down here. I'm sure I speak for all of us. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it made me who I am. Right? Yeah. But I appreciate that. Thank you. Just checking to see if I wish I could talk to you guys. Yeah.
I will share your contact information with everyone
Oh,
in a
thank you
follow-up
very much.
email.
Yeah, and it's a direct number to me here at the center. And we have a very good resource directory of all different groups and just different programs. And I know there are some holiday programs coming up.
Yes, I can share that as well.
Yeah, that's great. I'm not doing that one, but I know there's 2 coming up.
Mhm.
So this has really been an honor. It's funny, when I spoke to, I think, Linda and her colleagues, I was about doing this. We were like, will anyone come? Because again, no one wants to talk about grief. So I'm glad that you guys showed up, and maybe it will help you a little, and maybe help a friend one day, right? Or a family member.
Mhm. So I want to, at this time, thank you everyone for joining us. We kindly ask that you take a few minutes after today's webinar to complete the program survey. The link to the survey has been added to the chat for your convenience. And a special thank you to Marian for dedicating your time and expertise today. If you have any additional questions or comments, you can send an email to communityhealth@atlantichealth.org or call. It is 1-844-472-8499. And that concludes our webinar. Have a good day, everyone.
Great. Thank you again. Thank you, Linda. And thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye.